It was the 24th of July, 1880, and our town was going to celebrate. We usually celebrated on the 24th of July. The parade was the chief feature, and we always exerted ourselves. Among those early on the ground at the public square were Grandmother Hapgood and her 7-year-old great-grandson, Glenn. The old lady took a lively interest in all that went on around her, and noticed at once the beautiful brand-new flag which headed the procession. Then she smiled reminiscently, as the martial band went shrieking and thumping by the tune of Yankee Doodle. It was so like the good old time, but a lump came into her throat when she recognized in the hands of the color-bearer the dear old faded flag which she herself had helped to make in the early 50s. A half a dozen prairie schooners, with various trades and household avocations going on aboard, represented the companies crossing the plains. These she watched with the sympathy and interest of the aged who had lived and suffered. And when the handcarts followed, with their accompaniment of snickering girls and boys, she saw only the pathos of it. So when little Glenn looked up, smiling his approval of the show, he saw the tears tumbling over each other down Grandmother's withered cheeks. He squeezed her hand in sympathy and quickly questioned, "Were you with the handcarts, Grandmother?" "No, dear, no, but I had a very dear friend who was." "Tell me about it." "No, no, son," Mama interrupted. "You surely wouldn't ask Grandmother for stories today." And Grandmother added, "Tomorrow, child, after I am rested, you may come up to my house and I will have a story ready. It may not be about the handcarts. We will have to get Aunt Liza Burton to tell you about those, for she was with them. But I guess I can think of something from my own experience to interest you." So the next afternoon came Glenn, and found Grandmother comfortably seated in the coziest and shadiest part of the vine-covered porch ready for him. His little bare, brown feet pattered noiselessly over the porch to the stool at her feet, and a sweet picture he made to Grandmother's partial eyes, with his bright face and clear eyes, and his shapely body clothed with a fresh brown linen suit. She lovingly patted the handsome, close-cropped head and began, "So you wondered, did you, Glenn, if Grandmother came with the handcarts? No, we were not even with the pioneers, and I see it vexes you that there are honors paid to any of our old people which Grandmother doesn't share. But they earned 'em, dear, they earned 'em. The only reason I know of that we were not of the pioneers is because we knew nothing of the restored gospel until 1851. And that was 4 years after the valley began to be settled. We came in 52. The very first home we had, your grandfather and I, was in western New York. It was built in the virgin woods many and many a year ago. For your grandfather, it is great-grandfather, you know, dear, was just 2 years older than the prophet Joseph. We were very young when we were married, he being 19 and I 17. And his father joked a great deal about our going off alone in the woods to live. He called us the babes in the woods, saying we would get frightened and run home the first thunderstorm that came up. But it was only joking after all, for he was proud of his sturdy 6-foot son, who tipped the scales at 225 pounds. I was always tiny enough, though, but my weak hands performed a giant's labor after all, as your dear grandfather would say if he were here. He had a yoke of steers and a cow, and my mother gave me, besides, some homemade quilts, and a small stock of dishes and a couple of geese. That was about our stock in trade to begin life with. But we had youth, hope, and health, and the frontiersman's adaptability. Our first home was built of the trunks of the trees felled to clear the farm. The logs were squared with the broadaxe, and your grandfather made a very nice job of it. Even the floor was of hewn logs, innocent of nails. The window was a square hole with a bit of cloth tacked over, and I cooked over the fireplace till he got time to build me a nice Dutch oven. My husband's father owned a large sugar orchard, which had been worked by himself and 5 sons, of whom your grandfather was the eldest. There was plenty for all and more than they could handle, so he told William to use all the trees he could tap and take care of. They had always carried the sap to camp in buckets fastened with a yoke, slung over their shoulders. William set his wits to work to think out a better way. He built his sugar camp much on the same plan as his father's, but he tamed, trained, and rigged his steers to do the carrying, and in this way he and the steers did the work as 6 men. He would bore a hole in a tree when the sap was running, arrange spout and bucket to catch the flow, and so on from tree to tree. Later, he would collect and haul to camp where the sap was boiled into syrup, often staying till midnight and after to sugar off, and I would take my little spinning wheel down there to keep him company. At the end of the maple sugar season, we had $1,000 in gold as his earnings in sugar, as much as his father and all 4 of his younger brothers had made. And oh, how hard he had worked for this nest egg. We prospered as a rule from that time on, for we were both industrious and good managers, and it was virgin country of many opportunities for the man who knew how to take hold. His father cheered our pluck, and he didn't laugh at us any more. I spun flax and linen for our bed, and table linen and clothes. And one of my first ambitions was the homemade bed tick, filled with nice, clean straw, the homemade sheets and quilts, and the nice, soft pillows made from feathers picked from my geese, for a spare bed when any of our folks came to see us. And as the geese increased to a flock, the pillows and the feather beds increased to a flock too. Then, after a time, a sweet little baby came. And the years brought more work and more babies, until they also increased to a flock. And there were flocks of chickens and geese and turkeys, pigeon, cattle, horses, and hogs. And the clearing was enlarged. And there were fields of grain, vegetables, and fruit. A new house replaced the old, but nothing I have ever had since has given me quite the joy of our first little cabin, made by your grandfather's own hands. Our barns overflowed, our smokehouse was full of meat, and the milk house down by the spring under the maples was sweet with butter and milk and cream and cheese. Our house was always one of open-handed hospitality. It was our natures, for the matter of that. It was also the custom of the country. Our neighbors lived somewhat at a distance, for we all owned much land. We got time to do but little visiting only in winter. And then they would come by the sleigh load and stay for 2 or 3 days sometimes. I baked my doughnuts by the barrel and my mince pies by the 50s. So you see, crowds of companies didn't put us about much. We women would sit and knit and talk and enjoy each other's society. And in the long evenings we played games, told stories, and had music and dancing. We did not ourselves take much stock in the warring religious factions of the day, and had lived too remote for much visiting and church-going, only, as I say, in the winter time. But on the whole it was an innocent, a happy, and independent life. We were honest, temperate, industrious, and virtuous. And that is good soil, my son, in which to plant the seed of the true religion when it does come. Had we lived only for this life, I should rather have ended my days upon that first farm than any place I have ever seen since. But there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough-hew them as we will. And our full, quiet lives there was only a phase, an experience, a preparation for what was to come. After a while our section began to fill up. Towns and cities sprouted like trees around us. Our parents were dead, and my husband's brothers followed the van of immigration into Oregon. We too got the westward fever and sold out and moved to the edge of the great prairie. Life was different, but we were adaptable. To me, the place was notable for one important experience, for here I heard my first gospel sermon. Mormonism and Mormons were not mentioned, but it was Mormonism nevertheless. It happened in this way. One day when the men were all away bridge building, an old man came to the door and said he would like to rest and get a bite to eat. I invited him in and placed a chair for him, and then busied myself preparing comforts for him, for I was in my element when waiting on somebody. I got him the very best I had, for he was the last person you would ever confound with an ordinary tramp. The scanty hair on his head and his long flowing beard were white as snow. His face was somewhat weather-beaten, but not particularly wrinkled, and his eyes were dark and keen, yet withal benign in expression as a patriarch of old. His clothes were old and patched, but scrupulously clean. His shoes were whole but rather heavy for the season, and very dusty with much walking. So I prepared a basin of clean, cool water, and towels that he might remove them and refresh himself before he ate. And while I got things ready for him, he talked. And as he ate, he talked, and afterwards for quite a space. And the words of one of old came to my mind. Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have to give, I give unto thee. For the words that flowed from his lips were like living water. He spoke of the mission of Christ and the subsequent apostasy of the church, of the false doctrines and false prophets which followed, of the present condition of the world, and explained the true form and pattern which must characterize the true church in every age of the world. Then he laid his hands on my head and blessed me, and prophesied that I should hear and accept the true message when it came. And he gave me a new name, saying that that was the name I should bear, and departed. I sat for a minute or two pondering what he had said and wondering in some instances what he meant, when it occurred to me that I had let him go away without offering him a bit of lunch to tuck away in his pocket for his supper. I reproved myself for the omission, but there was still time to repair it, so I ran around the corner of the house to call him. The road stretched either way straight over the level prairie for miles. There wasn't so much as a bush big enough to hide a man, yet there was not a soul in sight. I waited and watched, and finally searched every outbuilding on the place, but he was gone as utterly as though the ground had opened and swallowed him up. I had accepted his coming as the most natural thing in the world, and had asked no questions as to occupation or destination. No thought of mystery had occurred to me. Yet now I remembered he was wholly unlike anyone I had ever seen. I had delighted in his spirit and presence with an unquestioning trust of a little child. But now a feeling of fear and awe crept over me. But I could not solve the mystery, and I never saw him again. Soon afterward I moved to where your grandfather's work was, so as to be near him. And our home was on the line of the Mormon exodus. Many a wagon full of this wronged and despised people passed our door. But I shall always remember what my little boy said when the first wagon train came by. We had gone down to the gate to see them pass, for we older ones did not know much about Mormons either. His father set him up on the gatepost, and stood with his arm round him to steady him. The boy sat with his eyes as round as saucers, watching them for a while. And then he turned and said, "Why, Father, I can't see but what they look just like other people." His father laughed, and one of the men who was walking beside his wagon smiled as he answered, "Why, Sonny, did you think the Mormons had horns?" Many a weary family we succored and sheltered in the weeks that followed. Our gates were opened to them always, and your grandfather often gave them work while they rested their worn-out teams, that they might have provisions to proceed. Neighbors warned us against them, telling gravely what the thieves they were. But we knew better, for we had never lost the smallest article from them. We respected their poverty, pitied their distress, and as we grew to understand them, we also grew to understand their religion. We saw blight fall on the crops of neighbors who cursed them and refused them food. And we saw their wells and springs go dry when they had refused them water, while we prospered in giving, and always had plenty to give until our neighbors grew jealous and hated us, and called us Mormons too. So we were at heart, and so we were also in the name when the gospel is preached to us. It seemed to me that I had always been converted, for it was the same gospel the mysterious old man had preached to me. Then soon we made our sacrifices and joined the march toward the Zion of the West. And when I received my blessings later in the house of the Lord, the new name given me was the same as my mysterious visitor had prophesied I should receive. And I knew then for the first time what he had meant. Wasn't that a glorious testimony? Who was he, you say? Child, ask Mama to read you the 28th chapter of 3rd Nephi, and then tell me whom you think he was. As for me, I know. And Grandmother nodded her head gravely, and though she smiled on the little auditor, there were tears in her eyes. After a little, when Mama came to see about her charges, she found her little boy curled down with his head on Grandmother's lap, both extremes of childhood asleep, and both dreaming dreams of the future.